If you ask people what they think about religion, you often get one of two answers. Religion is the source of war, violence, abuse, and hypocrisy, or a route to love, kindness, tolerance, and mercy. Put another way, it's either what divides us, or it's the thing that can actually bring us together. I'm Dave DeSteno, and for this episode of How God Works, we're sharing a live event that we recorded last month at WNYC's The Green Space in New York City about how religion can divide and unite us. My guests were Central Synagogue Senior Rabbi Angela Buchdahl, author and Christian historian Diana Butler Bass, the University of North Carolina's Deepest Beliefs Lab director Kurt Gray, and the Aspen Institute's Religion and Society program's executive director Simranjit Singh. Over the course of a wide-ranging and sometimes moving discussion, we talked about where religion fits into the deep social, political, and moral divisions in our society, and whether we can learn from what religion gets right to find a way to come back together. So let's get started. We'll start with the problem, which is, how does religion divide us? So, Angela, anti-Semitism is one of the world's oldest prejudices. But while it's been around for almost as far back as we can appear, it ebbs and it flows. Right now, unfortunately, it's rising. There's been an uptick in hate speech and violence directed toward Jews. Marches like Unite the Right have happened. And people like Kanye West are saying things like, I'm going DEFCON 3 on Jewish people, and the Holocaust didn't happen. Why do you think anti-Semitism is on the rise right now?
I think that history has shown us that anytime there is kind of deepened polarization, massive economic disparity, a sense of despair and hopelessness, rising fascism, that these are the circumstances that make it very ripe for, first of all, for there to be a scapegoat, which is something that is as old as the Bible, that people want to have someone to blame it on. And it's and there's just been plenty of texts and references for centuries to make the people to blame this on, the Jewish people. And I think that, I think I'm reminded of having sort of studied anti-Semitism a little bit more in the last 5 years than I had in years before that, started to understand the deep roots, how much this is ingrained in our society, in our religious languages, and actually in a lot of Western culture, just period. And so I think that it's very hard to root it out, and it's very resilient, and it shapeshifts. But I think that in particular, the circumstances we're in right now makes it particularly ripe for anti-Semitism to grow.
And do you think it's something particularly about religion, or is religion kind of a stand-in?
I think that religion is the stand-in. I think that obviously there are religious forms of anti-Semitism, meaning there were ways that I think Christian anti-Semitism very specifically wanted to talk about the fact that they wanted to show that as the example of what Christianity had proven wrong, or had proven as, we have superseded that philosophy. And so there were very specifically is that. But then there's just also, kind of economic kind of anti-Semitism that had to do with Jews being in professions like money lending. And then there's also kind of anti-Semitism that comes from things like blood libels, and sort of just that it actually doesn't really have to do that much with the religion. It just is sort of cultural and economic. And so I think, unfortunately, there are many forms of it, but I do think religion is one of them.
Okay. And what do you tell people in your congregation? I have young daughters. I can only imagine how it would feel to feel like you're a member of a group that people are targeting. Do you tell them to kind of keep your head down, in the sense to not call attention to yourself and become a target? Or tell them to kind of keep their head up and have pride? What's the best way to combat it?
A disturbing study this year found that 50% of college students right now who are Jewish hide the fact that they're Jewish. Oh. And I found that so upsetting. And it's not just one study. Just also I'm seeing this with my own students. Mm-hmm. And so, yes. So actually I felt it was important enough that one of my 2 sermons at the High Holidays this year was actually about Jewish self-dignity and pride. And I do think actually that we can't always change the anti-Semite. And I think that that's going to be a project that we can't probably finish or accomplish in my lifetime, as ending anti-Semitism. But it's vitally important for sort of just our own dignity and self-identity that we actually are proudly Jewish, and understand what that means, and have a deep and thick sense of Jewish identity and community, and coming together around that, and standing up for ourselves. I have a student who had a really strong anti-Semitic incident in school. He ended up leaving that school, but wrote to the principal. I don't think it changed. They wrote back some sort of polite comment like, well, we're looking into it and we appreciate your thing. But in some ways, he said, his mom said it didn't actually matter what the response was. It was the way he carried himself. Instead, he was so angry before and felt so powerless. And after he wrote that letter, even though it didn't maybe have the impact he wanted, he felt empowered that he had written it and that he had stood up for himself.
I like the point you're saying that when it ebbs and flows sometimes because of issues throughout history, economic issues, or even now with issues of stress and that people are facing, and feelings of powerlessness, that it can cause a rise. And so there are prejudices that exist throughout history, but there are some that can really get kicked up a notch because of certain events that we face. So, Simran, you grew up in Texas, where I assume being a Sikh made you stand out a little bit from the other kids around. But you're also in high school when 9/11 happened. How did that change things for you?
It's a good question. In some ways, it changed everything. Racism was not something new for us growing up in Texas. I was born and raised there. We were the only family with turbans in all of South Texas. And so racism was very much a part of our daily experience. And it's not to say that it's the only thing that we thought about. It's not what dictated our lives, but it was something that was on the back of our minds constantly in terms of how are we going to ensure our own safety. The day of the terrorist attacks of 9/11, when they showed that image of Osama bin Laden on the screen, I knew immediately that my life would change forever. And that day, my mom picked us up early. My brothers and I took us home. We locked the doors, and the death threat started that day. First as phone calls, then people driving by. But it had a few incredibly profound impacts on me. One is this experience of understanding that it didn't just matter how I saw myself, it also mattered how other people saw me. And up until that point, I had always dismissed other people's ignorance or stereotypes and said, let that go. You can sort of live your own life. But when it came to a point where those perceptions became violent, then it wasn't safe to ignore those anymore. And I think for me, that's what moved me into a position of saying, I want to be proactive about this hate. And that totally changed the trajectory of my life. It's sort of what spurred me into this commitment that no one should be terrorized for how they look or what they believe. And that's not just about my own community, that's about anyone who's trying to live their lives in dignity. And so I think that's probably the most profound impact of that experience when I was 18 years old.
In some ways, it reminds me of the story Angela was just saying about the student who decided to stand up for themselves and to do that. So when you made that decision, did you, at that time period, how did you kind of stand up? Your parents, of course, it sounds like, were worried about you. So how did you feel? Were you frightened at the time? Were you confident? Were you angry? How did you deal with that change, with all of a sudden people seeing you differently or assuming you were Muslim?
Yeah, all of those feelings were there. The fear, the anger, the desire to do something. To some degree, I was 18 years old. I thought I was invincible. Mm-hmm. Didn't really take seriously how intense the violence was until there was a murder. And that was only 4 days after 9/11 of a Sikh man in Arizona. Mm-hmm. And as we started listening to these stories and stories of my friends being attacked and recognizing the seriousness of it, I think that escalated my personal fear a little bit. I mean, if I'm being honest. And it also made me look beyond myself for the first time in my life. I think up until that point, I'm a high school student. I care about sports. I want to hang out with my friends. All I want is to have fun. And I started to see the real pain that people I cared about, and even people I didn't know, I could feel that pain that they were going through. And I think that the welling up of empathy inside of me was different from anything I had experienced before. So yes, the anger was there. The confusion was there. I didn't really understand what to do when I saw myself one way and people saw me differently. Like, that didn't make sense to me, and there was no good answer to that question. But that feeling of empathy was really new for me. And in a way, that's something I've been trying to channel ever since.
So I want to be clear about one point, which is all religions can cause people to act in harmful ways. We're seeing that with Hindu nationalism now in India. Even Buddhism, a religion that's known for its emphasis on nonviolence, is being used to foment anti-Muslim violence in Sri Lanka. But in America, traditionally, it has been a Christian country. And so for purposes of this discussion, I want to focus a bit more on Christian nationalism. And so let me turn to our Christian historian here. Diana, why do you think we're seeing this uptake in Christian nationalism? Why all of a sudden is it on the rise and coming back?
I think the primary reason right now is demographics. Several years ago, it was almost a dozen years ago now, I started giving a series of lectures in different church settings across the United States on the coming demographic wave of how America was just becoming less Christian and that it was becoming less white. And I remember standing in front of audiences just presenting a PowerPoint slideshow like any college professor would in such a setting, and feeling in the room levels of tension rising. And a part of my job there was to point people toward what the future was looking like, with hopes that churches and institutional sort of Christian organizations would be able to adjust their missions in a new environment, would be able to think about ecumenism and interreligious development, and what would it mean to have a Christianity that was a rainbow-colored Christianity and not just white Christianity. So I was standing in these rooms with all these great intentions with this data, and realized that it was being received in such a way for many people that it was causing them fear and worry. And it was exhausting to be on the road and have that be the emotional response to presenting what I thought was going to be helpful material. So I remember thinking about it a dozen years ago. I thought, I'm scaring people here. And what does that mean about our culture? And I began to hear people say things like, how can we stop this? And when I heard that, even coming from sort of moderate, these are people who you would not consider to be folks who would be extremists in any sense, but they wanted some level of familiarity and comfort, and certainly wanted to be seen as being the people who were in charge of the culture, and that they didn't want to lose that position of privilege. So I think that that's the genesis of it. Not every person who was in those rooms, because I work mostly with moderate to liberal Protestant churchgoers, I think that a lot of those people have come to better terms with that data, but huge numbers of Christians have not, and see that kind of data as deeply problematic, as a threat to their sense of identity, as a threat to their history, and a threat to their children's future. And so that, I think, all of that fear has fueled what we're seeing right now in these extreme manifestations of Christian nationalism, even in local congregations and places where one would not necessarily expect it to be. And the conversation this summer has been remarkable. As a person who has been following this now for as long as I have been, to all of a sudden see it burst into public consciousness. And for several weeks this past summer on Twitter, Christian nationalism was one of the terms that trended the most.
So I'm sensing a bit of a theme. It's interesting that you felt the palpable change, the palpable fear in the room, the sense of what is this going to be like for my children? What's it going to be like for me? A sense of threat. Simran, after 9/11, there was this sense of threat. I think it was, for most people, the first really attack on the American homeland that they could imagine. And for many of them, it was a threat from a foreign group of conflict. With anti-Semitism, it's ebbed and flowed, and throughout history, as Angela said, there's always been this sense of this group, the Jews, are economically privileged and they're in control of the media. Again, I feel powerless. And so, Kurt, I'm trying to get a sense of what's the scientific reason, in the sense that the way our mind works, the conceptions we have of God, when we feel threatened, when we feel our way of life or our privilege is threatened, how does that alter the way we think about God?
Yeah, great question. So some of my work suggests that when we make sense of morality, that's ultimately grounded in our feelings of threat and where we see harm in the world. And if we see our own groups being threatened, and we see kind of tangible harms coming to ourselves and our families, right? We see those other forces as not just bad, but evil. And I think, to your point, there are many evils in the world, I think, that could threaten you, but I think religion done wrong, in some sense, maybe we'll get to later, is, you can use God as an ultimate authority to reinforce those perceptions of evil. It seems like when people make moral judgments, they typically think that God is on their side, right? So if you think marijuana is A-okay, then you also think that God thinks marijuana is A-okay. And so if you think that this other group is evil, then you have kind of the divine stamp of approval for not liking that group. And then, because religion is so diverse, even within specific traditions, you can kind of selectively pull from aspects of that religion to reinforce those narratives of evil and hate. So we have some work that suggests that, when conflict comes, right, you pick those Bible verses that are most aggressive, most warlike, and use those as a subsequent justification for, doing spiritual battle, hating the other side.
So you've looked at this even through history, right? And so as conflict happens, people's conceptions of God and the way they assume that he, she, or it wants them to behave becomes more punitive, becomes more punishing. Is that right?
That's right. So if we look at the Bible verses that people emphasize, when conflict rises, they pick the Bible verses that are most strident, most warlike and aggressive.
If they're sensing conflict,
if they're sensing conflict,
of power,
right? They want a stronger God who's gonna stand up and protect them and fight for them. They want a kind of crusader. Right. And we have other work where we get people to, using this kind of complicated scientific face matching kind of thing, to basically figure out what people think the face of God looks like. And we don't ask them to draw God, but we kind of do it sneakily. And what you show is that generally the folks who are more likely to see threat see a kind of sterner, more powerful God, right? So it's even in their implicit sense of who God is, and even and it's always a man in our studies, what he looks like. But it's a great question.
So what you're seeing, I think, is as the pressures that we're under and the threats we're under change, our conception of God can go from a more loving God that makes us want to cooperate with other people to one that is more punishing and can justify our own violent behavior. Diana, this always strikes me as very difficult to understand, but when I'm watching TV now, I'll see pictures at Christian nationalist marches of Jesus holding an AK-47, or people justifying harm in Jesus' name. And let me read this because I want to get it right. When I think of Jesus' teachings on dealing with enemies, one of the most famous things he says is from the Sermon on the Mount. And he says, "You have heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." So is what Kurt's saying, does that resonate with you? Do you think as people feel more under threat, they look for those other more punitive, punishing aspects of God to justify it?
I have seen that in action. I mean, it's like, I don't think it's true. I've witnessed that.
You've lived the data.
and it's interesting to hear Simran talk about 9/11, because at 9/11, I was actually working in an Episcopal church in Alexandria, Virginia, and it was very close to where the Pentagon attack was. I was in a staff meeting, and we heard the planes fly low over the church building on that morning. And so I came back to church. We came back after the attacks, like on Thursday, and like, what are we going to do this coming Sunday? And I said, well, I quoted that exact verse to the people who were working on staff. I said, we have to pray for Osama bin Laden, and we have to pray for the people who have done this, because everyone in DC just assumed that we kind of knew where this was coming from. And people, oh, we can't do that. And when I suggested that, first of all, with the staff, they were resistant, but they knew it was kind of the right thing. And so they began sort of running out this idea to the congregation, and the congregation almost split over the suggestion of praying for the enemies in that sense. And instead, what a significant group in that church wanted to do is they wanted to cover the entire church with patriotic bunting. They sang the national anthem, and when they got to the really horrible verse about God's vengeance on our enemies, it's like the third or fourth verse of the national anthem, people were singing it with such vigor. I never heard them sing Amazing Grace.
Didn't even know that verse existed.
There's a really awful verse deep down in there. And so anyhow, it was really interesting to see this church that you would have thought was just sort of your basic neighborhood church. And that was exactly their response to threat, was to throw that verse out the window about praying for your enemies, and instead adopt a vision of God as the one who was going to get vengeance on the people who've done this wrong. And so if I could witness that just in a setting like that, multiply that by all of the thousands and thousands and thousands of congregations and the way that people were feeling on that particular day. And I think it's a great example of the research that Kurt has done. The face of God changed on 9/11.
Yeah. And Simran, how about you now? We are not after 9/11, but it is a period where there are rising tensions, especially intergroup ones. You live in New York City. Is your experience different, or are you still experiencing people responding negatively to you at times?
Still responding negatively. I mean, it happens often enough. Happened last week in Midtown. So it's still pretty constant. I think one of the differences that I've seen, at least in working with hate crime victims within my own community, it's strange, right? You're working with these individuals who have seen the ugliest face of humanity, who have been attacked, brutally attacked, and they have every reason to be angry. And consistently, what's been striking to me is they haven't been. And what's the question for me has become, what is driving them to respond in this way, where they are able to hold on to the humanity of this person. And I wonder if part of it, at least the way we think about it in the Sikh tradition, there is no, at the highest level of being, there actually is no enemy. It's not that there's love your neighbor and love your enemy. There's no distinction between anyone. And part of what I've been thinking about has been, at least for me in these situations, my practice, sort of like Angela's example of this child, my practice in that moment is for my own spiritual well-being. Because I've learned that if in these moments you allow yourself to dehumanize the people who are dehumanizing you, you're actually stripping away your own humanity. And instead, if you can find it in yourself to see the humanity in the person who hates you or wants to kill you or whatever they say to you, if you can do that, then actually you are embracing your own humanity and practicing it in a way that will make it even easier to do so in the difficult moments. So that's just something that I've been reflecting on personally as to the value of leaning into that perspective as opposed to, what feels more natural in a lot of spaces, including anger and vengeance and so on.
Yeah, it's interesting. We just recorded an episode with the Christian theologian Miroslav Volf talking about forgiveness. And what he said is forgiveness is a gift because it allows you to help the other and redeem the other and let them realize that there is good in them by offering them forgiveness, and also redeem yourself. And I think what you're hitting on there is a really important theme. But let me ask you a little bit more about finding that tolerance, because I know for the Aspen Institute, you spend a lot of time crossing the country working on trying to foster religious pluralism. And you're talking with people of every religious stripe. What do you find are the biggest blocks to people being willing to open up or accept or talk to other people? Because sometimes religion it's not that Sikhs or Jews or Christians are wishing harm on other people. Sometimes in certain extremist groups they do, but sometimes it's like, well, I don't wish you harm, but you people over there, you got it wrong. Like, I know what God really wants. And so how do you begin to foster respect across those divides? And even with the atheists, there are folks like the New Atheists now, Richard Dawkins, Steve Pinker, Sam Harris, who think all religious people are deluded, right? That religion is a plague on the rational mind. How do you start to cross those divides?
One framework that I found to be consistently effective is to help people understand religious bigotry through other models they're already familiar with. And so if we take something like race and racism, or homophobia, or classism, and we can help people see how our way of treating one another is also on the basis of hierarchy that then produces supremacist thinking. Nobody wants to be that. They're not always aware that this is the trap that they're falling into. All of us are falling into these traps constantly. And I think religion is particularly vulnerable to this. Even the phrase holier than thou. It is this idea that religious people just think they're better than other people. We think we have answers that other people don't, whether that's from, my religion is better than yours, or I have access to something you don't, or you're the same religion as me, but you don't do it the right way, right? Like, we're constantly thinking this way. And so to me, one practice that has been effective has been helping people to see how their own behaviors fall into hierarchy and supremacy. And another one that I think is particularly effective is taking those ways of thinking and being in relation to other people and measuring that against values. You as a Jew or a Christian or a Muslim or a Sikh say you believe in the dignity of all people, and what does your behavior say? And I think when you start to see it that way, that gap between your aspiration and your practice, it's like a slap in the face, and it really wakes you up to how you want to be different.
And Angela and Diana, let me ask you a similar question. I think both Judaism and Christianity, its own way, are kind of there's a theological exclusivity about them, in the sense that there is one God and there's one way to worship that God. If you're Christian, it's through Jesus. If you're Jewish, it's through Yahweh or Jehovah. And so how do you have pluralism? That is, if you're a person of deep faith and you believe in your faith, and this is the one way to be. How do you foster a respect for people who hold different views?
You go first. I'll think about it.
I think that the way that you frame the question shows one of the divisions within Christianity itself. Because as a Christian, I don't think there is only one way. I think that Jesus offered a way of salvation, a way to live in the world, just a wisdom of teaching and practice that, obviously has been the well for 2,000 years now of people across the world who have found life in all of that. And so that's the tradition that I was born into. It's what I know. And for me, I can't imagine being anything but being Christian. But I own that realization opens me up to the very real knowledge that other people with other wisdom traditions, with other saints and heroes, with other holy books, with other deep practices, feel that same way, is that they cannot imagine the shape of their lives without these stories, without these rituals, without these memories, without a particular language. And so when I, as a Christian, encounter folks who have those different stories, what happens for me is it opens my heart. I want to hear their story. I want to hear the rituals that form their lives. I want to hear how they see light and love and mercy and compassion in the world. So for me, being a Christian actually opens me up to diversity, opens me towards pluralism, opens me towards others. And of course, that gets me on endless trouble on social media.
I was going to say, do you think that's a common view or not? Yeah.
Well, with some Christians it is, but with a whole bunch of other Christians it isn't. And so the question about pluralism is actually a question right now that's striking to the hearts of the division within Christianity. And there are tensions within Christianity now that are so enormous that they're riven across every denomination. And Protestants are fighting about this, and so are Roman Catholics. Pope Francis, I think, is a wonderful example of a Christian whose Jesus opens a heart towards the world and a whole variety of cultures and expressions that are Catholic and not. And there are Catholics who absolutely hate him for that and think that he's not a legitimate pope because he is not standing there proclaiming the hierarchy of the church as the one way to God. And so I guess for me, I want to make sure that we understand as we're having this discussion that Christians do not all share an idea of a singular way, but instead we understand a way that we have encountered, a way that has shaped us, as a way that opens our hearts towards all of humankind. And then there are Christians who do see it that way. And so we're fighting about that.
I'll begin by saying that you won't get just one answer from the Jewish people on this, but and I'm clearly informed by the fact that I have a Jewish father and a Buddhist mother and a Christian evangelical aunt, and so I grew up really understanding that I don't think that any religion has a monopoly on religious truth. But I would also say that Judaism in general feels like Judaism is the best path for Jews. And I think one of the most misunderstood ideas about Jews is this idea of a chosen people. And there are people who can interpret this in different ways, but I think a very mainstream way, and the way that I really see it, is that Jews are chosen for a particular mission. It's not chosen to be better or number one. It's really chosen for this particular mission. And there's a sense that every people has a mission and every faith group has a mission. So you need to do you the best you need to do you. And so there's a sense that there is a way to walk in the world as a Jew, that if this is who you are, that's the way you should be. And there is a great way to do that. But if you are, especially as a religion that in general over the centuries, for lots of reasons, has essentially not been a proselytizing religion, we're not looking to say you should all be what we are. We just feel like you need to manifest your religion and your God in the best way possible that brings more love and healing and dignity and integrity into the world. And we're going to do it in this way for us because that's who we are. And so I think that if everyone kind of understands that we each come in with our own sort of religious vocabulary and rituals and boundaries that actually kind of shape who we are and how we're supposed to walk into the world. Jews have a very particular one. And I would say one of the things that has changed in Judaism is how much more open we are, how more permeable our boundaries are for bringing people into the community. That's not meaning that we're out there proselytizing, but it just means that we've become sort of less sort of culturally homogenous in a way. And maybe in some ways we've always been that. You know, in the Bible says we were a mixed multitude when we left Egypt. In some ways we've always kind of been a mixed multitude, but there have been ways that in America we've sort of been very homogenous and culturally exclusive, it feels. But I think that's also changing as well.
In some sense, the three of you are really hitting on something that I want to turn to in a minute, but I have a question for Kurt first, which is that at heart, the real spiritual experience or sacred mystery or whatever you might call it is this sense of oneness, of love, of openness. And if we can foster that part, I think we'll get somewhere. But before we pivot to that, I know, Kurt, you're working with the One America movement on bridging divides. What are you finding there?
Yeah, so it's super easy.
You have my vote.
That's right. So the One America movement is a bridge-building organization in different faith groups, and they work primarily with Christian folks who find their congregations divided, and they're trying to equip their leaders, so preachers and pastors, with the kind of skills to make sense of those divisions and hopefully heal them. There's lots of techniques they use. So my work with them draws from the research that I've done, and we try to kind of emphasize that folks on the other side of whatever issue we're talking, even within the same congregation, but also, you know, Jews and Christians, they work some Muslim groups as well, are fundamentally moral people. All right, they have the same basic moral sense. And the way that we do that derives from some of my work about how our morals are ultimately grounded in how we see harm in the world, these narratives of harm. And so one thing we do is we get people to reflect upon their own kind of assumptions about where threat is in the world, what they find threatening. And then the trick is something that folks typically don't appreciate. And I'll back up and say, if you ask Americans in general what they think will make them respect someone's view on the other side, whatever issue, they will tell you that they want facts. Like, just give me the facts. We're all into science or not, but whatever. I just want the facts.
My facts.
That's right. Well, that's right. Exactly. So you give them the facts, and then they say, those facts aren't true.
Right.
Right. And we're not even talking about persuasion. We're just talking about just respecting the opinions of the other side in a pluralistic sense, right? That you can have a different perspective, and that perspective is valid. And so we've studied this with arguments about guns, about abortion, about all sorts of hot button topics. And what we find is, instead of facts, what really helps is sharing personal experiences, particularly those involving harm, right? So the reason I have this particular view on guns, let's say, is because one time I had to use a gun to defend myself. That would be a pro-gun argument that people would say, okay, right? Like, I don't buy the statistical truth of that, but I understand, your truth, and we talk about speaking your truth. And so people in today's era of fake news, right, where they're not sure what's true, they really do respect people's lived truth. And so sharing those lived experiences, particularly those experiences involving suffering and how you try to protect yourself and your family, those are powerful at creating bridges across divides.
So we've been talking a little bit about how religion can divide us, how it can lead to hostility and violence, and also just to kind of misunderstandings and who we care about and who we understand. I want to pivot a little bit now to start talking about some of those practices, things like Simran mentioned, that can actually foster compassion and kindness in us. There's some evidence that religion can actually do this. Unlike a lot of ideologies, right? It's not just something we can divide ourselves along, but it provides tools to help us reach a goal. And as any behavioral scientist will tell you, ask her if you don't believe me, having tools is important to reaching our goals. Think about your New Year's resolutions, right? 25% of them are gone by the second week of January, 8% make it to the end. The only way to really form habits, change your goals, is to have tools. And so I want to talk about that, but I want to start by just relaying a little anecdote that people often use when they want to show the power of religion to bring people together. And this was an event that happened about 108 years ago, almost to this day, something that's known as the Christmas Eve Truce. In 1914, outside of Ypres, Belgium, the British and the Germans were fighting a long trench battle. And one evening, as the British were looking out across the trenches, they started to see lights appear, and they didn't know what they were. Then they started hearing music and songs, and they couldn't tell what they were saying at first because it was in German. But they recognized the tunes, and the tunes were Christmas carols. And then what happened next was something that none of them would have expected. The people came out of their trenches into this no person's land between them, an area where they had been shooting at each other and trying to kill each other. And the men started sharing stories and showing pictures of their family and giving trinkets as gifts to one another. And by their own words, right, it was something that none of them could believe. You know, here we were trying to kill each other yesterday, and now we're celebrating together. To me, though, there's one thing wrong with this. It's a wonderful story, but it's not a great example of how religion can bring people together. Sure, singing Christmas carols might have brought up the idea of loving your fellow human, but I don't think it's the reason these people stopped fighting. I think the reason they stopped fighting is because they realized they had something in common, right? That is, they stopped categorizing themselves as British and German and thought of themselves as fellow Christians. And as Kurt and I will tell you, we can produce similar stuff, not with guns, thankfully, but in the lab, anytime, bring people in, highlight anything that they share in common, and people will start showing favoritism toward those of their own group. If we bring you in and put red or blue wristbands on you and give you a reason why, soon after you will start favoring the people who are wearing your color wristband and giving them more money or food or whatever we may have. To me, the true test of religion to do good is when it helps us care about people who aren't like us, when it helps us increase our moral circle of concern to people who we know are very different from us, yet we become willing to care about their pain and to help them, as Kurt just said. If we can understand each other's suffering, and we can understand that everybody is motivated to prevent harm, then we can begin to care about those other people, to understand where they're coming from and to try and help them. what I want to suggest to you is that this can happen. It does happen. And I want to talk about how we can make it happen more. But as one wonderful example of when it can happen, Andrew, let me ask you about the time that your neighbors down the street, I believe it was a mosque near you, experienced a fire. And traditionally, not of course in Angela's community, but traditionally the stereotype is that Muslims and individuals who are Jewish, there's been a long sense of animosity, yet you guys welcomed them in. How did that happen?
So the story began that it was the week of the shooting of the mosque in New Zealand, if you remember the Christchurch shooting. And so it actually began with a show of support and solidarity. This is a mosque that is actually down the block from us. But actually we had almost no interaction with them, and not for lack of trying, just felt like we were just not kind of connecting. But members of our community stood outside the mosque with signs of just support and protection for several days actually after the mosque shooting. It was only because they were outside the mosque on a Friday, I think the shooting had happened several days before, that we understood that there had been actually a fire in the bottom floor of this mosque building that they had thought would still allow them to pray upstairs where their main space was. But literally hours before kind of the main prayer time on Friday, the fire department said, "I'm sorry, it's not safe for you to have people in here." And they were, normally at prayer they would have 50 people, but because it was the week of this particular mosque, they were expecting 400 people to come. So very quickly, our own members who were just outside, one of our rabbis who was outside, called and said, "Can we do something about this?" And I said, "Let's just invite them in." And so, and it wasn't just that we invited them to use our space, which was a block away, to pray, but our team kind of like set up washing stations for them. We just set up mats. We happened to have a bunch of yoga mats from a yoga thing we had done before, so we put those out, and there was just a very beautiful sense of sharing. And and it's one of those stories that, someone took a picture of, and it was such a picture. And so it went a little viral. And then this actually opened up a relationship with the mosque. And so the very next week they invited our leadership and clergy to come. And so I think that it was actually began out of a place of empathy and beginning, but then also just stretching ourselves a little bit. And I was very proud of our community.
So I want to talk a bit more about how we can do that, right? How we can actually experience that and make it happen a bit more. Simran, one of the fundamental principles of Sikhism that I know you talk about a lot is something called, and forgive me if I pronounce it wrong, ikonkar.
It's perfect. Good Punjabi.
So, what is that? Is it loving kindness? What is it?
So ikonkar is the first word in Sikh scripture. It's the first concept you learn as a Sikh. It's the first concept I learned. It's the first concept I've taught my daughters here. And it literally translates as one creation. And I think what's powerful about this concept to me, I mean, it's in and of itself, it's just a phrase, right? But if you can go deeper into it, and I think this is what Sikh wisdom really expounds upon, it creates a way of looking at the world that in many ways is contrary to how we think about it here in the West. And I'll offer two entry points into why I think that's the case. One is the nature of hyper-individualism here that we're experiencing here in the US, where everything feels like it's mine, everything feels like it's about me, and even our interventions, our conversations on diversity and inclusion, for example, are still primarily based on experiences and categories of individual identity. And what I think ikonkar and Sikh philosophy is not the only tradition to offer something like this. Other religions do too. But what it offers is a way of understanding that actually the self doesn't come first. the connectedness of the world comes first, and you're a part of that. And to understand, I think, to understand it in another way is to say, if ego is what divides us constantly, and we can do that on the basis of, race or caste or gender or whatever, if ego is what's dividing us, then selflessness, understanding ourselves in relationship with one another as opposed to in contradistinction to one another, is a solution. And so I think that's the fundamental building block of Sikh philosophy that I fell in love with. It feels so different from what's constantly dividing us.
So it is a sense of...
Can I just offer
Yes.
that, like, I heard it said, and I wish I knew who said it first because it's beautiful, but that the opposite of spirituality is not atheism, but the opposite of spirituality is narcissism. And I think that, I really think that points to that, like, I think religion at its best is a constant reminder of, this is not just all about you. You are actually part of something much bigger than yourself, that you are obligated to something bigger than yourself. And that feeling of understanding that is, I think, what all religious traditions at their best actually force us to confront, put us into habits and holidays that actually reinforce those values and pull us out of our self, constant self-reflection and narcissism. And so I think that is, I do, and now of course that can get very corrupted in every religion, and that to me is, where we take God's name in vain, whatever religion, when they abuse it in that way. But I do think that that's at its best what all our traditions are pointing to with different languages.
But what you're saying, and I want to get back to Simran's practice in a second, but I think it's an important point to make here. You said when we have our rituals, when we have our holidays, one of the most, to me, compelling verses that I've heard recently about how religion does this, and my friend Jeff Middleman, who is here, always reminds me of this, is the line from Exodus, which is, normally we do things because we think about them and understand them and they make sense. But, and correct me when I'm wrong, but when Moses when Moses was reading the covenant to the people, they said, we will do and we will hear, meaning we will understand. And sometimes what that means is doing the practice comes first. Even if you don't understand why we have these rituals, why we have these practices, it's because they nudge our minds and bodies in ways to find those spiritual experiences. Is that fair?
100%. I mean, I think that one of the great things that religion teaches us are the habits that help us be the people that we actually aspire to be, but we aren't always doing. But if you actually do the actions, before you know it, you realize, oh, I am a generous person. I am a forgiving person, because religion mandates that in a sense. And then you start to realize, even if that doesn't feel like who you are, at a certain point you start to do it, and then you become that person that religion asks us to be.
Yeah. So Simran, Ikawankar is this sense of interconnectedness. What's the result of that? So in psychology, we know that if we feel closer to someone psychologically, more connected with them, we care about them more. So does that bring about a feeling of love?
That's how I would describe it. In our tradition, we use different language to explain this, but I think one thing that's more universal than a particular language is the experience of love. And so, I mean, a very simple way of understanding this experience is to say, just think about who you love. That relationship, they don't have to be with you. Like, my girls aren't sitting here with me right now. I still feel connected to them, right? Connectedness, when you experience that, is a feeling of love. And I think the promise of spirituality is those fleeting moments of love that are at the height of human emotion. We can have that in every moment of our life, right? If we can learn to experience our lives as love. And the other aspect of this that I think is crucial, at least to my own understanding, is the natural impulse of someone who loves is to serve. And, if I love my kids, I'm going to do for them what they need, whether I want to or not. It's not really a question, right? It's not even an obligation. It's just what is, right? It's just what you do. And I think that aspect of spirituality for me is so critical to understanding how someone who loves is so committed to justice. And there are so many examples we have in human history from this. And again, it doesn't have to be religious, but this feeling of interconnectedness that goes beyond the self, that goes beyond the tribal, and extends to the shared experience of our humanity. That's something that's really powerful about religious ideologies when they show up in the West.
You took the words out of my mouth. We do hard things for people. We sacrifice for people who we love. Sometimes we do things because we think we should, but the really hard things we do because we feel we should, and love is a powerful emotion there. And I know in Sikh practice that service is called seva. Is that right?
Yeah.
And so how do you make a habit of seva? Not for your daughters, but for other people in the world.
Yeah, I love what you said, Angela, about habit earlier, and this is what religion asks of us. And I can share an idea I learned in graduate school that was very helpful for me in understanding this, and it comes from Foucault, the French philosopher, and he talks about the technologies of the self, and he says, essentially, if you look at what other people are doing, it might seem strange to you from the outside, right? And you might call it an empty ritual because it's not something that has meaning for you. And it may not be even something that they can articulate the meaning for. But what I've experienced, and I'll give you the example of wearing my turban, I don't really have a good logical explanation for why I wear a turban. I mean, I can give you some historical reasons, I can give you some ideas, but within the literature of Sikh history, there's no actual explanation. But what has it done for me functionally? And I will tell you that my character internally is so much stronger because every day I am reminding myself, you're going out in public, people are going to make judgments about your community based on how you look. And so you better behave. And there's a lot of pressure in that. But it also means that every single day I'm practicing my values, whatever I ascribe them to be. And so that daily practice is putting me in a position, what Foucault calls ethical cultivation, right? It's strengthening my inner fortitude so that when tough moments come, I'm ready to respond with my values.
And Angela, in Judaism, I know there are similar conceptions, of course. There are two terms, and I often get them confused, so maybe you can help me with them, which relate to kind of caring for and serving others. One is tzedakah, which is acting to help other people. And I know it's often translated as charity, but I know that's not exactly it from what you've told me. And then there's another concept which is called, and I'm going to mispronounce it again, I'm sorry, Gemilut Hasidim.
Yeah, you did great. Yeah.
Can you tell us the difference between those and how you can go about cultivating the second?
So tzedakah does actually come from the root for justice. So it's not seen as charity, which is often something that is like your heart is moved to give and sort of a generosity that comes from that place. It's actually seen much more as balancing the scales of something that is unjust. But tzedakah, generally speaking, is a giving of resources. So when you give tzedakah, you're usually giving money, some sort of physical resource to someone who is in need. Gemilut chasadim is our acts of loving kindness, or actually another way of thinking about it literally is sort of gamal is to cause something to happen. So it's actually acts which cause love in a sense. And so when you are engaging in those acts, they are the acts that actually engender love, not just in the person who receives the act. They are actually feeling loved, but actually it's in the doing that you actually feel the love as well. It's again, you think about how that interaction actually increases your own sense of love. So Gemilut Chasadim are acts of loving kindness. And again, that almost implies that it's something that you'll do out of love that comes from the feeling of love first. But actually, Judaism expects that we are doing these acts and that the love is the experience you will experience that are caused by doing the acts themselves. So a lot of the acts of Gemilut Chasadim, we are not asked to do them. We are obligated to do them. We are commanded to do them. In fact, there's, there are a lot of commandments, but doing acts of gemilut chasadim, acts of loving kindness, which include things like visiting the sick or being with someone who is in mourning. These are obligations that come upon us that are just a given in the community. Just the fact that when someone loses someone, that the community is obligated to make a minyan for them, which is a gathering of at least 10 people in order to pray. So Jews just feel an obligation to show up and be there. You're not supposed to even invite people when a baby is born and you have a bris. You're supposed to announce it, and the community is supposed to feel obligated to just show up and be there and provide for you. And so I think that these are ways that a religious community actually builds the muscle of putting more kindness into the world and actually creating that sense of love. I'm sure you've heard this before, but the Torah has love the stranger 36 times in the Torah as a commandment. Love your neighbors once. Love the strangers 36 times, because it's a lot harder and we have to be reminded of it. But it also that's a very high bar that we have to actually expand beyond our just our neighborhood, our tribe. And so these acts are actually commanded for us in lots of different ways.
And how do you cultivate them? Just by following those commandments, making them a habit?
Yeah, so there are ways that those things are a habit. I mean, literally the top 10 list of the kind of obligations we should do are built into the daily liturgy. So if you are a person who prays regularly, you're actually reminded and you go through that list every single day. But also it's built into communal living. So for, the ways that Jews will sort of announce deaths, we have a tradition where if you are a mourner, you show up at services, you stand up for the mourner's prayer. Why do we do that? Not to put you on the spot. You're someone who's just lost someone. We do that so everyone in the community knows they're a mourner, so that people will come up to them and give them comfort and make them feel like they're not alone. So there are ways that I think that when you are in communal spaces, we constantly have, I would call them spiritual technologies that reinforce this sense of obligation, community, and acts of care and compassion for each other that are built in.
It's funny you use that term. I first heard that term spiritual technology from Krista Tippett, and I've stolen it. So thank you, Krista, if you're listening.
I heard it from Rabbi David Ingber, but it's great.
It's a wonderful term. And it's funny you were talking about prayers. I know one of the things that Jews do regularly is a practice called the Nisim B'Shol Yom or something like that. I'm saying it wrong, right? Which is a way of infusing the day with gratitude.
Right. So for everyday miracles.
For everyday miracles, that you feel it repeatedly. And Diana, I know you spent a lot of time studying and writing about gratitude. How do you see that as a habit that comes from your spiritual practice that makes you willing to kind of have a table that's open to everyone?
Oh my gosh, the way you just said that was what was echoing through my brain.
Well, I think I heard it from you originally, so it might be.
The way this connects very deeply with my Christian experience and then expands into the world, I think is an interesting example of how a practice can open its arms. And that is, at the center of my life as a Christian is this ritual act that happens every single Sunday in church. I'm an Episcopalian, and so every week we celebrate the Eucharist. And the Eucharist is also known as the Lord's Supper or Holy Communion. And Eucharist in Greek, the word that we use in the Episcopal Church to refer to that part of the ritual, means really great, amazing Thanksgiving. And so at the center, being an Episcopalian, is a meal of thanks. And we actually enact every single week with those little goofy crackers and the little sips of wine. It's hard to imagine it as a banquet of Thanksgiving and abundance because of the way it's just structured to, fit in a big congregation. But what that is supposed to do is remind us that the gifts of God are for the people of God. That's the central sort of line in the Eucharist. And I think that when I first heard that as a child, I imagined God giving a gift to me, and that the people of God were only the people in the congregation. Mm-hmm. But for right now, whenever I hear a priest say that, the gifts of God for the people of God, my imagination has matured really over a lifetime of participating in this ritual, from it being about me getting a gift from Santa, God in heaven, and that gift was going not only to me, but to my friends in this close circle. But now I literally see in my own mind's eyes the universe bursting with giftedness. Mm-hmm. And whenever the priest says, the people of God, I want to just run out into the streets and feed everybody, because who are the people of God? And so at the center of the ritual life of liturgical Christianity is a table that is constituted by gratitude, that reminds us of the endless abundance of the universe, that there is enough for all, that God has set this table in the wilderness, and that all people are God's people. And so as a practicing Christian, that is just how this ritual has sunk into my soul over all of these decades. Mm-hmm. The table has gotten bigger. The awareness of gifts has gotten more vibrant, and the understanding of who is invited has opened wide. So I think that in a certain way is what a lot of contemporary Christian theology has been pointing toward. In the 1960s, we began to get a movement in these liturgical churches, Catholic, Orthodox, Anglican, Episcopal, Lutheran. It was a liturgical revival, and all of those movements, Vatican II and the different liturgical changes in these other denominations, were all geared toward one thing and one thing only, and that was the centering of the table in the communal life of Christians, taking down hierarchies and reimagining the biblical story and the Christian life all through the image of a table. And so that, of course, is tied to Eucharist, giving thanks. So that's the theological piece of it. But the working out of that in the world happens in all sorts of ways that are theological to me, but could be theological to Angela in a completely different way. But yet we understand the fundamental sort of similarities of a life of thanksgiving, a life of gratitude, living in relationship to gifts, that all people are God's people. And so it works. We can be in agreement about that, even though we come to it through different practices and rituals. And so then you begin to have interreligious understanding, shared stories. But then it works out, gosh, every time I see Jose Andres on television or being interviewed in some place of crisis, and he says, my job is not to build walls, but to build a bigger table. Mm. And so I literally go from the crackers and grape juice in my Methodist childhood church of my earliest memory to wanting to get on an airplane and fly to the Ukraine and help serve food, right? Help feed hungry people in a war zone. Yeah. And so to me, that is how faith practices, spiritual practices, can work over a lifetime. That they dig into your soul to the point in time when they expand really to the whole of the world.
Mm. So, Kurt, one last question before we close. As a psychologist who spends a lot of time thinking about moral decision-making, how we understand other people's harms, who we're willing to talk to, who we want to avoid, as you hear all of these spiritual technologies, do they make you think of any strategies? Do you see them, I was going to say echoing, but in some ways kind of presaging? They were around long before your and my science was. Ways of fostering community, or do they give you ideas for things to try?
Like try to join a congregation?
No. Try to adapt to get people to talk across ideological bounds.
Yeah, I think I think Simran mentioned the kind of ego first up, and I think all these spiritual technologies, as you've all said, really involve the kind of dampening of the self. And I think religion and morality at their best are about kind of subjugating our self-interest and the narcissism that we have and connecting with others, including those in our community. And these technologies, I think, do just that, right? They decrease our sense of self, and not in the bad way, but in the kind of terrible way that when you think about social media and you wonder if you're doing as successfully as someone else, like that terrible way. And so a lot of the technologies involve some kind of like physical kind of community, right? And I think you have some data on this, right? About synchrony, right? When your bodies move together and you're part of a group of people, it's this primal force of you lose sight of your individuality, but not sometimes in a bad way, but often in a very good way, especially if the purpose of that synchrony is not to harm others, like if you're marching, with a destructive aim, but instead with a hopeful intention that's full of light and energy, as exists in many religious faiths. So
yeah, I think one of the things for us, and I know you've talked about this, is if we understand harm is happening to people, how do we expand our moral circle to have concern for them? We all know it's biological fact. We tend to be more concerned about people who are closer to us. In your experience, how do we expand our concern for whose harm we care about?
Yeah, so we just published a big review of basically how to reduce partisan animosity. Mm-hmm. And religion's not the same thing as politics, but they're pretty closely intertwined. And there's lots of ways to do it. But generally what you need to do is you first need to correct misconceptions that the other side is so different than you, that the other side, it hates you. I think that's one of the main misconceptions that people have, that someone who's different than you hates you. And once you realize that, look, Muslims don't actually hate Jews, right? Who knew? Well, because you need to do the next thing, which is to actually have meaningful contact, right? To reach out and to have positive contact with folks. And often to do that, you need to have skills. And I think this is what's frequently overlooked in kind of building practices of connection, is you need to make people feel like they can actually have conversations. Like if you were on the subway right now and someone had a Trump hat or something that looked, very progressive, and you were like, I don't agree with that, right? And they come at you like that, like you don't feel like you're ready to have that conversation, right? You don't feel ready to have that pluralistic.
No, you feel threatened, which we spend a lot of time showing how that makes us think, God is a little more punitive, and so should we be to defend it.
But you can build those practices, right?
Yeah.
Like you can build that muscle to want to bridge divides and to connect.
I think that muscle idea is important. So what we've seen today really is that our conceptions of God can vary, and when we are under threat, when we feel devalued, when we feel like our way of life is changing, our tendency is to become more defensive, and our view of God, both how we picture God's face and the verses we look for, tends to lean toward the aggressive and the hostile, and we use that to justify things. But the true religious experience, as you've heard everyone here say, is that sense there are different ways to God. You be you. Let's have a table. These technologies help us, whether it's Ik Onkar, helping us understand the interconnectedness of everybody, gratitude, cultivating gratitude in Jewish prayers regularly or in the Eucharist helps us experience that emotion, which makes us feel more connected. You're seeing these technologies change us and make us more willing to then take that step that Kurt says, which is to not feel threatened, but to reach out and to be willing to talk to someone, to lend them a hand. It's putting us in that state. There are lots of ways to get to that experience. It's something the mystics were always after, right? And when you have this experience, people describe it, whatever tradition you're in, as an experience of deep connection of everyone and deep love. There are lots of ways to get there that are outside of religion. You can do psychedelics. Everybody on guided psychedelic trips talks about this. The last way you can do it often is through meditation. And what we know from meditation, from our lab in general, even in a secular sense, is that it increases people's compassion and reduces their desire to actually lash out at people who they might normally lash out and escalate violence. And so I want to leave you as we close with an experience of that, because I can't give you magic mushrooms. So we're gonna. Sharon Salzberg, who is a friend of the podcast, agreed to record a brief meditation for us, 3 or 4 minutes, and so I'd like to end with that, because I think it's an example that you can all feel, a way to build a habit of expanding that moral circle to people that we might not normally feel it toward, so that we can engage in Gemilut Hasidim or Seva and feel these things and feel the gratitude and have those conversations that Kurt is urging us to have. So if you'd like to, please participate. If you don't, feel free, but please go ahead.
So if you want to sit comfortably, you can close your eyes or not. Wherever you feel most at ease. And just let your energy settle into your body. And for this session, I'll just suggest some phrases. And we are the first recipient. You don't have to try to force a special feeling or make anything happen. Just see if you can gather your attention behind one phrase at a time. When your attention wanders, bring it back. So I'd suggest, may I be happy. May I be peaceful. Just repeat those over and over again silently. And then think of someone who's helped you. Maybe you've never met them, they've inspired you from afar, or they've helped you directly. Could be an adult, could be a child, could be a pet. Someone like that comes to mind, you can bring them here. Get an image of them, say their name to yourself, get a feeling for their presence, and offer these phrases of loving kindness to them. May you be happy. May you be peaceful. And then someone you know who's been having a hard time lately, been having some difficulty. They seem to feel alone, they're anxious, whatever it might be. Bring them here. And offer the phrases of loving kindness to them. And then whoever comes to mind, friends, family, colleagues, will offer loving kindness to the collective, to the group. May you be happy. May you be peaceful. And then all beings everywhere, all people, all creatures, all those in existence. near and far, known and unknown. May all beings be safe, be happy, be healthy, live with ease of heart. May all beings be peaceful. When you feel ready, you can open your eyes or lift your gaze. We'll end the meditation.
So what you're feeling there is a conscious way to expand who feels similar to you, who you feel connected with, whose harm, whose pain is worthy for you to feel. And in that interconnection, it helps us experience and understand that everyone has that light within them, what the Sikhs call Jyoti, right? And what the other traditions may call a spirit, a soul, a Buddha nature, whatever it might be. And so yes, religion, like any other ideology, can be used to divide us. And yes, when we feel under threat, it can affect, as Kurt's work has shown, our conceptions of God and make us see that God as less loving and more punitive and punishing. But if you go back to the heart of the traditions and the heart of the practices, there's a correction there for that. Because the issues of violence and hostility and strife existed long before we scientists got here. And there's a wisdom there that we can learn from and adapt. And so I encourage you, in whatever way you see fit, whatever way you want to do you, to look to that and to not be hostile toward religion, even if you are kind of an atheist. There is a wisdom to those practices. And I thank my guests for sharing that with us. And I thank Kurt for telling us how our mind works and how it interleaves with religion and can cause us to see the world in one way or the other. And hopefully we're going to nudge it toward a more open and tolerant way. And with that, I want to thank my team because they are the heart and soul of this podcast, and without whom I would be up here blabbing and sounding not nearly half as good as I sound when you hear me on the radio. So let me thank them. Our senior producer is Josie Holtzman. Our associate producer is Sophie Eisenberg. Our executive producer unfortunately couldn't be here today, and Genevieve, I hope you and your daughter are feeling better, is Genevieve Sponsler. The person who makes it all sound really good in terms of audio, does our mix and master, is Merritt Jacob. And the executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. And I thank also the John Templeton Foundation for supporting us, and John Cunningham, who is here and is the director of public engagement for them. Thank you. And I thank all of you for coming.